Very funny.
We now give you our brand new little sweetheart of swing.
Welcome to Stay Tuned, the show for animation lovers, recorded live on YouTube and proudly streaming on Patreon. Coming to you from Austin, Texas, I'm your host, Phil Machi. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Tonight's First Impressions is something of a 2-for-1. The DC animated universe takes another crack at one of the most monumental comic book events, the death and return of Superman. All that, and you'll have a chance to share your thoughts, questions, and opinions with me for a live Q&A after the show. I remember sitting at the dinner table with my family back in the early 90s. As usual, the nightly news was on TV, and to my surprise, so was Superman. Back then, support for superheroes, or even cartoons for that matter, was nowhere near what it is today. Yet there he was, on the news. And apparently, he died. The cultural reaction to this passing was undeniable. Now DC Comics is looking to remind us all why we should care about a world without Superman with a pair of feature-length films. And I'll explain why this most recent attempt makes a difference in just a few moments. But first, this. And some music will be played here, and then we'll go from there. How do you kill a man whose reputation in comics is essentially that he's a god? How do you kill a man whose reputation in comics is essentially that he's a god? That was the question posed in the writer's room over at DC Comics, and in 1992, the beginning of the end for the Man of Steel was released in comic book form. So yeah, tonight we're dealing with the death of a fictional character, but it does stand to mention that once anyone known the world over, fictional or otherwise, is suddenly removed, there's an impact. And Superman is arguably one of the most well-known people, which is saying something. He was, in many ways, the first superhero of popular culture. So why kill him off? In a word, sales. Okay, so quick history lesson. The comic book industry has had a number of highs and lows. The early 1990s were full of growing pains. Tim Burton's Batman film made ripples in the industry that are still felt to this day. Heck, Marvel almost went bankrupt and started selling the rights to their characters to various movie studios, which was certainly one way to offset costs. Another way to deal with tough times is to shake things up a bit. Sometimes you revamp an entire universe by wiping the slate clean, and other times, you just gotta kill a guy. When coming up with new ideas to generate more reader interest, killing off Supes was submitted as a joke, but one that ended up being taken seriously. That nearly year-long saga between the last son of Krypton and the creature known as Doomsday ended with the ultimate sacrifice. Since that time, Warner Bros. Animation has been adapting tentpole stories from their vast comics archives for animation. Naturally, the death of Superman comes to mind as a grandiose slugfest that practically begs to be seen in motion. And they already tried it back in September of 2007. Superman Doomsday was a 77-minute adaptation that loosely collected the events from the comics, And while it boasted some of the highest sales for any DC direct-to-video property, its short runtime and huge omissions from the source material left a lot to be desired. Chiefly, the reason we're here tonight, because to me, the strength of the overall saga is not Superman's death. I find the question posed by that massive battle far more interesting. What would the world be like without Superman? If a superhuman savior overlooking the protection of Earth were to suddenly vanish, the effects would be astronomical. Obvious Christian allegories aside, and believe me, there are plenty to be had here, the vacuum of power left open alone would represent a huge threat to humanity. I mean, think of the individual people who were saved by Superman. Perhaps they would feel the loss more than anyone. Superman can be a really difficult character to write, but I think the cornerstone of his story, the story of an alien who finds a home on Earth, is his humanity. This is what makes the death and return stories so interesting. Just the idea that a man so foreign to this world would give his life defending it, something most humans would probably never do, is compelling. It's good fodder for filmmaking, and the original story has enough moving parts that 77 minutes couldn't truly contain. This two-parter brings to mind the 2012 adaptation of The Dark Knight Returns, another story so big Warner Brothers took 2 films to tell it. In Reign of the Supermen, Supes is now out of the way, and 4 mysterious figures have stepped in to pick up the slack. A man in a metal suit wielding a massive hammer, calling himself Steel. Think Iron Man meets Thor. A young punk being groomed by Lex Luthor, whom the media nicknames Superboy. Then there's Eradicator, what you would get if Superman were to have a robotic personality, followed by a literal robot who evokes serious T-1000 vibes. These Supermen define Part 2 and turn it into something of a mystery story. Surely if Part 1 is the brawn, Part 2 is the brains. Obviously, none of these 4 beings are Superman. Yet, there is reasonable doubt that the alien who sacrificed himself to defeat Doomsday couldn't have come back in an unexpected form. It's enough to get Lois Lane curious, and so as the audience, we too find ourselves asking, what the heck is truly going on here? One of the challenges faced by the DC animation team is that they've been adapting a number of stories written before the New 52 timeline started in 2011. What makes this so difficult? It's all about context. During certain timelines, for example, the Justice League has a different lineup of members. And in other timelines, Lois Lane still doesn't know Clark Kent is Superman. So, for the animated adaptation released only 6 months ago, how did this translate to film? In a word, better. That initial comic book storyline was more or less a stunt. Mind you, it was an incredibly successful stunt, but since so much time has passed, it's given modern-day writers a chance to view the events in hindsight. I think the story of these combined films has been realized now in a cohesive way. Let's talk visuals. The New 52-inspired series of films, as a general point of fact, have an anime approach. They have incredibly large set pieces, thrilling action sequences, and during the quieter moments, a lot of lip flapping. What I mean by that is dramatic scenes with exposition are made up of mainly still images, with the majority of motion coming from talking heads. Do I wish there could be more fluidity and expressive motion throughout the stories? Absolutely. But these are decisions made based on budget, and to be fair, the action in this 2-part story is still quite impressive. which is something to keep in mind when comparing to films like 2018's Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Sony tossed $90 million at that film, and it was money clearly well spent. But these direct-to-video features from DC tend to cost an average of around $3.5 million. So, yeah, they're making do with what they have. With all that taken into consideration, both parts of this adaptation are crisp and clean and pleasing to the eye. What's not pleasing to my eye is the costume design for Supes in this animated continuity that started back in the Flashpoint paradox. There's just something about that much navy blue on Big Blue that makes me cringe every time I see it. Story-wise, I found myself enjoying part 2 more than the first. And if someone were to only watch the death of Superman without the return, I think they'd be disappointed. Both films work best when seen back to back, which is precisely how I viewed them earlier this month. Roughly 500 theaters across the country held a limited double feature Fathom Event on January 13th and 14th, which had a much more appropriate combined runtime of 2 hours and 45 minutes. Now, I had already seen part 1 6 months ago when it was released straight to home video, but with a story filled with so much action, it was absolutely more enjoyable on the big screen. What surprised me, though, was that Reign of the Supermen seems to have a slight edge in quality. The animation felt sharper and more on model. Some of the lip-syncing in part 1 doesn't quite line up, which was distracting. Pacing was also improved in part 2, which led me to wonder what changed during production, and if perhaps there were 2 different teams working on both films simultaneously. Obviously, there were some major differences between the comics and the movies. Most notably are the members of the Justice League. Without going off on too big of a geek tangent, I'll just say the heroes of the comics who were available at the time to fight Doomsday featured less of the heavy hitters, which does change the way the story gets told. But make no mistake, Doomsday comes to life in Death of Superman. You know, before Superman kills him. His final battle with Supes is nothing short of epic. When those punches land, you feel it. A key side character from the comics is Bimbo Babowski, and yes, he's exactly what he sounds like. A big lovable teddy bear of a guy who owns a bar called Ace of Clubs. He also happens to be a huge fan of Superman, and in the comics, claims to be his biggest. Bimbo is meant to represent the everyman, a blue-collar tough guy who works hard and laughs harder. It can be all too easy to play this wrong and come off as cheesy, which was my impression from part 1. Charles Halford's portrayal of the Big Galoot worked better for me in Reign of the Supermen, but this feeds directly into where I think both films are lacking: subtlety. I actually think John Goodman would have been a better choice because, honestly, between Dan Connor and Fred Flintstone, he has nailed the lovable big guy routine. In this telling, it's Lois who coins the term Doomsday instead of the hero Booster Gold, who does not appear in the films. Lois only recently learns of Soup's secret identity before losing him altogether. Rebecca Romijn takes a more no-nonsense approach to the character, the result of which is very grounded, possibly too much so. All in all, this is the most accurate retelling of the tale you can find, short of reading the comics themselves. It's certainly more robust than Superman Doomsday, and once you know the full story, 2015's live-action Batman v Superman film will really confuse you. Because, come on, Doomsday makes 0 sense as an Act 3 villain. The only question surrounding this animated adaptation is it relevant in 2019? Superman wasn't the first hero to be killed off, but between his unexpected exit and triumphant return, timing was key for those first comics. The combination of what was then a struggling medium and a society that wasn't churning out superhero movies faster than the Flash himself left the door wide open to something dramatic. Faster than a speeding bullet. Okay. Nowadays, superhero films, animated or otherwise, have become so commonplace that it can be difficult to stand out in the crowd. For what it's worth, I think this was a solid effort, but at the same time, it's disheartening to see such a major entry into the DC timeline not treated like a bigger deal. Spider-Man proved a month ago how there is absolutely a market out there for quality animated superhero films in theaters. And while I was happy to enjoy these stories on the big screen, for such a landmark moment in Superman's history, the big guy deserves better than a 2-day Fathom event. Reign of the Supermen wraps up the death of Superman's story in a generally rewarding presentation. It keeps the thrilling action from Part 1, but has better pacing, improved visuals, and a more engaging story by comparison. And it's relatively faithful to the source material while still introducing some new interpretations. The voice work is pretty solid all around, with a couple of noteworthy performances. Specifically, Rainn Wilson as Lex Luthor, who brings a curled lip attitude befitting of Superman's most famous foe. Cameron Monaghan, who plays the live-action embodiment of the Joker on DC's Gotham series, switches things up here as Superboy. He brings a youthful spirit to the character that feels perfectly suited for a showboating hero. Superman himself is voiced by Jerry O'Connell, and whose performance I found more enjoyable in his moments as Clark. Both films were scored by Frederick Wiedemann, which was an excellent choice. His bold theatrics and big sounds capture the gravity of this Clash of the Titans as emotions and action runs high. Matching in quality to the music is the sound design. Like I mentioned before, the action in these films is top-notch, and part of what makes that happen is some truly visceral sound effects. Aside from adequate, if not lackluster acting here, aside from adequate, if not lackluster acting here and there, and a restrictive budget, Reign of the Supermen still delivers. Dividing the story into 2 parts works quite well, but I would highly suggest watching them together for a more cohesive feel. It's clear the team over at Warner Brothers knows how to maximize their resources. Look, I love Batman the Animated Series and the wave of creativity it generated since. That said, the quality of these movies rivals that of live-action films, so let's move farther beyond TV animation. What we get here is definitely a step up from the usual animated series, sure, and it's by no means bad animation, it's just limited. I'm not suggesting going CG, mind you. By all means, keep the traditional animation theme going, but there are heavy emotions running through this story, and a more sophisticated hand could better communicate that. Underperforming in this case can make it difficult to stay invested with what's on screen. To put it in perspective, Warner Brothers has been cranking out at least a couple of these films for years now. I understand the quick turnaround business strategy. I just happen to think there is greater untapped potential. After so many films successfully proving there is a deep love from fans and creators for these properties, maybe it's time to increase those budgets and decrease the frequency of the films. Marvel's Into the Spider-Verse has visuals that alone make me want to come back for more. It's the last missing piece of the puzzle for DC to really raise their efforts to a level worthy of the name Super. I'm collectively giving The Death of Superman and Reign of the Supermen 8 out of 10 pieces of kryptonite. And now for a short intermission where we'll listen to a little music from tonight's featured composer. That was a track titled Superman from DC's The Flashpoint Paradox, composed by Frederick Wiedemann. This is an alternate take, depending on what I get for music rights tomorrow. That was a selection of score from Reign of the Supermen, composed by Frederick Wiedemann. At the time of this recording, there have been no releases of the scores for either The Death of Superman or Reign of the Supermen. Both were scored by Wiedemann, who is no stranger to the DC universe. His credits also include Green Lantern, the animated series, and The Dragon Prince. The Death of Superman is already available to own, and Reign of the Supermen comes to Blu-ray, DVD, and digital this Tuesday, January 29th. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Thanks so much to all of you listening live on YouTube. I hope you enjoyed the show, and if you would like to support Stay Tuned and listen anytime, join me over on Patreon at patreon.com/PhilMachi to become a subscriber today. Among the cool rewards available there, you can also stream this show anytime you like, which means never missing an episode. For more fun, check out my original comic books at retailsunshine.com, and you can interact with me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook under the handles of both Retail Sunshine and Phil Machi. Also, you can keep up to date with the latest animation news by visiting this show at facebook.com/Stay Tuned Show. I've been Phil Machi, you've been a wonderful audience, and until next time, keep those eyeballs peeled, those ears open, and be sure to stay tuned. Alrighty, well, hey there. Welcome to the after party, of course, as always. Welcome. If you're just now coming in, I just provided a review for The Death of Superman and Reign of the Supermen, which I will repost tomorrow. But here we are at the after party, and here you are, and here I am, and we're here to talk about anything animated, anything that you are interested in. And while I'm waiting for you guys to throw some things up on the chat, I will remind you that I just uploaded a cartoon that I made back in 2002 when I was a senior in college, and it's called Better Off Hungry. It features my